Okay, so as you can hear, we're trying some new things with the sound, constantly trying to work and making this whole endeavor better. And hopefully in the future I'll have an actual decent microphone with which to record, but for now, I apologize. Please bear with me. I'm still new to this. But anyway, story time. Once upon a time, there was a man in ancient Japan known as Fujiwara no Tokihira. That is a name you are going to have to remember. Tokihira was an absolute stud. A giga chad, if you will, as the kids say. He was extremely good looking. He was fairly young, in his early 30s, 31 or so. He was very, very rich, being a member of the Fujiwara clan, and he had a very high rank in government. He was the left minister, which was one of the single most powerful offices that a person could hold in government. There were maybe one or two people above him in power. And because of his gigachadness, he was actually beloved by everybody. Everybody thought he was just stunning and amazing. They loved him. Men wanted to be him. Women wanted to be with him. Even the emperor himself thought that Tokihira was a swell dude. A good old boy, you know? Awesome guy. Awesome guy. He was the belle of the ball wherever he went. Everybody wanted to talk to him, wanted to hang out with him, were envious of him. So basically, Fujiwara no Tokihira was a big deal. But one day, during the Emperor Engi's reign, Tokihira came to the palace, as usual, for work, dressed in clothes that were not befitting someone of his station. And so the emperor noticed this and became indignant about it. Because again, to the ancient Japanese, what you wore, your appearance, propriety, all of these things were exceedingly important, like very important, okay? Like, in modern times, something to the effect of Tokihira wasn't wearing the most high quality suit that he could have. Maybe he was wearing a not quite a nice brand suit, or rather he was wearing an incorrect color tie for the season. It was probably something to do with that. It was probably something not super a big deal to us, but to them it was a massive deal. But anyway, the emperor was indignant about this. How could someone of his station wear something like that? To palace, to court business of all things. So the emperor called a servant over to him, relayed this message. Tell Tokihira that his clothing is not befitting a minister of the left, and he needs to exit the premises immediately and go change his freaking clothing. Now, this servant was not thrilled at this prospect. After all, there's the classic phrase, don't shoot the messenger. And the messenger didn't want to get shot. He didn't want to be the one to come to one of the most powerful men in the country with a rebuke from the emperor himself. But luckily, this servant was actually very brave, very daring, and he did as he was told. He went up to Tokihira and he said, Mr. Tokihira, sir, the whole time, probably shaking and trembling. The emperor says your clothes are inappropriate and you need to leave, sir. Now, as soon as Tokihira had heard this, he immediately went pale. This look of shock just spread across his face. He couldn't believe it. Having it pointed out to him, he probably now realized. And he immediately took off. Now, normally, when a nobleman goes anywhere, they have to gather all their servants together. They send some guys ahead to go clear the pathway to make the trip easy. But he didn't do any of that. He grabbed probably his servants who were immediately close to him, and they all just took off home. And once he got home, Fujiwara no Tokihira locked himself in his room, and he didn't come out for a whole month. He refused to meet anybody for business, for pleasure. Whenever anybody tried to talk to him, all he would say was, the emperor's rebuke still weighs heavily on my soul. I cannot meet with you. Until one day he finally left his room after being summoned to the palace by the emperor himself. Except, psych, turns out this whole thing was just a big scheme for the emperor and Tokihira to punish another guy. Who is this guy? Don't know. What did he do that he needed to be punished for? Doesn't mention it. How does this help in punishing this guy? No clue. All we know is that apparently Tokihira and the emperor had been scheming together to get this other guy. Again, what happened? The story doesn't mention. And I'm noticing something here, that this whole section of stories, if you haven't noticed, has been about the Fujiwara clan and how great they are, and how powerful they are, how smart, how good looking, how amazing they are. They get a whole section to themselves. So I'm starting to think that when they were the most powerful clan in the country, and they heard about these stories being collected and put together and written, they probably wanted to make sure that, they probably sent a few nice donations to the way of whoever was writing this. They just goodwill funds, if you will. Just make sure that we're put in a good light, if you know what I mean. That's probably what happened anyway. But one thing that was true, Fujiwara no Tokihira was a bit of a schemer, and it got him into trouble sometimes. But he was also, being smart, good-looking, rich, and powerful, he was also a bit of a playboy. And he did make his way around, shall we say. Now, at the same time, there is another Fujiwara man who's important to the story, Fujiwara no Kunitsune. Kunitsune was a grand counselor, which was significantly lower on the totem pole than Tokihira. Tokihira was one of the most powerful men in the government. And Kunitsune, this other guy, wasn't that high up. He was maybe just a bit above a middle nobleman, but he was not nearly as high. However, he was also Fujiwara no Tokihira's uncle. So we've got Tokihira, who's our main guy, and Kunitsune, who is Tokihira's uncle, the grand counselor. The other thing about Kunitsune is that he's 80 years old. He's an old man. Now, being an elder and being Tokihira's uncle, Tokihira was expected to give him a certain level of dignity and respect, owing to Confucian concepts about how youngers are supposed to treat their elders with respect, and men are supposed to treat their fathers and their uncles and the previous generation of men with dignity and respect. But Tokihira was higher up on the totem pole when it came to government and Japanese social status. But anyway, Kunitsune, the grand counselor, the 80-year-old man, had a wife who was in her early 20s and was an absolute beauty. Knockout gorgeous. Insanely beautiful. And she, like Tokihira, was also a big fan of good times, shall we say. She made use of her good looks, is another way of putting that. And because of this, she personally wasn't thrilled at the fact that she was married to an 80-year-old man. Seemed like a massive waste to her. But anyway, her story gets around. Being as beautiful as she is, rumors spread about how amazing she is. She's just the absolute best girl in town, essentially. And word of her beauty reaches the main character, Tokihira. So Tokihira, being the dashing Casanova that he is, decides he wants to meet this girl, shall we say. And so, just like before, he starts scheming. He starts coming up with plans. And he invites another, even more notorious playboy by the name of Taira no Sadafumi. Now, Taira no Sadafumi, you don't need to remember his name, but he was, a nobleman, but kind of a low rank. He was part of the Imperial Guard, but he was notorious for getting around. There was almost no woman in the capital, no adult woman in the capital, that he had not enjoyed a night or two with. Be they the daughter of a nobleman or another man's wife, or even those women in imperial service. He got around a lot. But Tokihira, wanting to know more about his uncle's wife, because she was so beautiful, managed to get him and this other notorious playboy in the same room together. They were having a little mini party, as it were. And so as these two men are partying and drinking into the night, talking, swapping poetry probably, enjoying each other's company, having a good time, Tokihira suddenly comes out and says, "Hey man, I have a question for you, and I want you to answer me honestly, okay? I know your reputation. Everybody does. But I'm curious, sir. Who would you say is the most beautiful woman you've ever been with? Who is the best one?" And Taira no Sadafumi, who was also a prince, by the way, he just kind of sighs and says, it is a little bit embarrassing, I have to admit. But since you asked me to answer honestly I shall answer you. I would have to say that the Grand Counselor, Fujiwara's wife, is absolutely stunning and second to none. Your uncle's wife is an absolute banger, no pun intended. And so Tokihira, hearing this, thought, great. That's exactly the topic that I wanted to bring up. And so he asks Sadafumi, "So, how did you even manage to get into her quarters anyway? How did you make contact with this woman?" And Taira no Sadafumi says, "Well, I have an acquaintance who works over at that lady's residence. And through this old acquaintance, I learned that she, being so young, isn't exactly happy being married to an old geezer like her husband. And through that acquaintance, I was able to sneak in and enjoy her company once or twice. And she was more than happy to have me, wanting to get away from her old husband. And the minister, Tokihira, when he heard this, he just smirked a devilish grin, a knowing smile, and said, "You, sir, you are truly a rascal," and poured him another drink. And so, Fujiwara no Tokihira began scheming to get with his uncle's wife. I mean, he's a Giga Chad, but he's also kind of a douchebag, in my personal opinion. But anyway, he thought about their relative positions. Tokihira was technically higher up in the political sphere, but this was his uncle he was talking about. And because Tokihira had always afforded his uncle all of the respect and dignity that was required, his uncle thought very highly of him, just like everybody else in court. They all thought he was a great dude. And Tokihira knew he could use this to his advantage. And so, New Year's rolled around. And New Year's is a big deal in ancient Japan. And with the New Year's comes parties, meetings, festivals, all sorts of things, all sorts of big events going on. And Tokihira sent a message to his uncle saying, "Hey, for one of the 3 days of celebrations, I would like to have it at your house. What do you think of that? Will you have me and my mates? Will you host us?" And the uncle, the Grand Counselor, was ecstatic at this. Like, he's gonna have one of the most powerful men come to his house and do him the honor of letting him entertain them. It's gonna be great. We're gonna make sure this is a great party. Everyone's gonna have a good time. We gotta make sure this thing goes off without a hitch. So he sets about making preparations, as any good host would. And he makes everything perfect, down to a T. Everything is prepared just right. There's enough drinks. Make sure there's good food. Make sure the decorations are nice. The house is tidy. Everything is just great. And so around 4 p.m., Tokihira and all of his friends, who are like the bee's knees of the government, all of the highest and most prominent people, are now hanging out at this old Grand Counselor's house. They're all chilling, and they're having a good time. Again, there's drink, there's food, they're all having poetry and song and music and chatting. Everyone is having the best time. It's a grand old time. And as usual, Tokihira was the toast of the evening. Again, he was the best looking, his poetry was just on point, his music making was amazing, and everybody just loved him. He was always the center of attention. And being the center of attention, he caught the eye of the Grand Counselor's wife. Now, she was behind a screen, because again, women were not supposed to interact or be seen by men with whom they weren't related. So she's behind a screen, but that way she can see what's going on without being seen and kind of participate in the festivities. But she notices Tokihira for the first time, and she thinks he's a Chad as well. That he is just absolutely drop-dead gorgeous. He's smart, he's funny, he's good with everybody around him, and clearly everybody likes him. So she can't take her eyes off of him from behind the safety of the blinds, But she is just awestruck at how amazing this guy is. And the whole time everyone's partying, Tokihira is constantly stealing glances over to the screen, constantly wondering, is she watching? What is she thinking? I hope she sees me, and I hope she realizes how much of a Giga Chad I am, is essentially what he was thinking. But the whole time he's glancing at the blinds, at where she is, she starts getting embarrassed. Classic fallen in love kind of a thing, A guy or a girl that you really like starts paying you attention, you might get a little bashful. And this was extremely normal and attractive behavior in ancient Japan at the time. But anyway, the party goes on, everyone's having a good time, and sure enough, everyone gets pretty dang drunk. Their clothes are coming a little loose and undone, their songs aren't as well put together, and probably throw some more funny songs in there, Everyone's a little more than tipsy, shall we say. And so, it came time for everybody to go home. And the host, the 80-year-old Grand Counselor, starts going around and telling everybody, hey, it's time to go. Thanks for stopping by. Hopefully we'll see you next year. Hopefully you enjoyed your stay, but I will have to ask you to leave. Apparently this is just what they did. But the uncle gets to his nephew, Tokihira, and says the same thing. Thanks for coming, nephew. I very much appreciate it. It is time to go home, and I would like to see you off. But Tokihira looks at his uncle and says, absolutely not, sir. I am exceedingly drunk. I can't go home in my current condition, I'm going to stay here and wait until I've sobered up a little bit, and then I will go home. But please, I will have my carriage brought up for that purpose. That's my impression of being drunk. And all the other noblemen kind of muttered and nodded to each other. Yeah, that seems like a good idea. That's a good idea. Well, I'll do that. And because it was the time when everybody was going home, the Grand Counselor was giving the people who were required to have them gifts, because that's what you did. Is, as a host, I guess you gave gifts to your guest as they left. I'm guessing they brought you gifts too. I don't know the details of how that little cultural tidbit worked, but that's probably what was happening. And so, to Tokihira, he gave him 2 horses and a very, very high quality flute, which was pretty expensive, quite frankly. But Tokihira, still being drunk, says, I'm sorry, uncle, these are nice gifts and all, and I'm sorry I'm saying this, it's because I'm so drunk right now. But if my coming here has really done you some good honor and you're very happy with what I've done, can you give me something a little more personal? Something special? My uncle, sir? And the counselor, the uncle, who was actually drunk at this time, thought about it for a second and was like, yeah, he did give me a bunch of honor by coming here, and he's made me a happy man. I gotta give him something. So thinking about it, and having nothing better close at hand, and remembering that he could see Tokihira's eyes constantly flitting over to the screen, he kind of sighed and rolled his eyes and said, well, I guess I could let him see her. A little glance isn't gonna be a big deal, is it? So he grabbed Tokihira, dragged him over to the screen and said, I'll have you know, sir, my wife is my greatest treasure. She is more beautiful than any woman you've ever seen. Not even a great man as powerful as you has a wife as beautiful as she is. I'm gonna let you see her. Just this once. 'Cause I love you. Man. Nephew. Oh, my acting could probably use some work. And with that, he pushed aside the screen, he shot his hand underneath the curtain, grabbed his wife's sleeve, and pulled her out so Tokihira could see her. Here she is, and presented her to him. This is exactly what Tokihira was hoping for. And Tokihira, probably seeming a little less drunk, said, You got me there, uncle. She is quite the beauty. Thank you, sir. And then he moved in close to her. And again, you have to remember, Counselor was drunk at this point. He wasn't entirely sure of what was going on, and being 80 years old, I'm sure that didn't help. So, continuing the efforts of shooing everybody else out the door, the old counselor starts going around and telling everybody, okay, the minister is going to stay here for a while because he's too drunk to go home right now, but everybody else needs to go. Please take your leave now, sirs. And some of them did, but some of the other noblemen decided they wanted to stick around and see what was going to happen. So instead of leaving, they kind of shimmied off to the side, hung out in the shadows, places where they could keep an eye on what was going on, because some of them probably knew or had some suspicions. So after everybody is getting shooed away and sent home, at that point Tokihira goes, you know what? I think I should go home too. Bring up my carriage. Lo and behold, his carriage was already brought up. And seeing this, the old man, the old counselor, again, still very drunk and not in his right mind, goes over to Tokihira's carriage and holds open the blinds for them, because they had like blinds on their carriages. That was kind of like a door, but not really a door. But he holds open their blinds as Tokihira, with his uncle's wife in his arms, going into this carriage together. And after getting her up into it, and then following himself, he had the blinds closed and told them to take off. Now the old man, seeing this and still being kind of drunk, he noticed that they were hurriedly making preparations to leave. And he, for some reason, he says something about, don't forget me, you old women. He yells at the old women. I don't understand where it comes from, but it's part of the story, so it's there. But he basically shouts, hey, don't leave me behind. And right after he said that, the carriage took off without him, leaving him at home alone. So the old counselor, being exceedingly drunk, stumbled into his bedchamber, disrobed, and plopped down on his bed thing and promptly fell asleep. In the morning, needless to say, the old counselor had a massive hangover. His head hurt, and he started trying to remember what had happened the night before. And everything was kind of foggy. He couldn't quite remember. Maybe some of the things he remembered actually happened. Maybe some of it were dreams. he wasn't sure. So he turns to some nearby servant women and asks them what happened last night. Also, where the heck is my wife? And they tell him the whole story. Sir, you introduced your wife to your nephew, who then took her into his carriage, with you right there, mind you, and you didn't say anything, and he left with your wife. He and she are gone. Needless to say, the old counselor was shocked. And despite seemingly being okay with it, like at no point did he raise any objections to the left minister, his nephew, running off with his wife, he was drunk out of his dang mind. And he was astounded that anybody would take advantage of a situation like this to steal another man's wife. But the bigger problem was, there was no way to get her back. She clearly didn't want to be with him. She was more than willing to just up and run off with this hot young left minister. And so he felt really stupid and really ashamed, and he couldn't go making a big scene about it. That would just bring even more shame. Like, how could he let all of this happen? And by his nephew, no less. What, was he gonna march right up to the most powerful man in the country, demand that he return his wife, while also bearing the shame of having been shamed by his nephew and being taken advantage of because he was old and drunk? Like, again, to the ancient Japanese, this whole situation was just really bad for appearances. And he couldn't risk staining his appearance and staining his reputation around court. So he just kind of sat there, stewing in misery and shame and unhappiness. And yeah, actually, that's pretty much the end of the story. Normally in these stories, there's a part that says, "Thus is it said," but for some reason that's missing here. So the story just kind of ends, which probably means that there's a portion of it missing and we just don't know where it is. But yeah, that's the story of Tokihira, the douchebag. Don't steal other people's wives. Okay?